So at this time, I'd like to welcome everybody to the GLJ webinar. It's New Streamlined Air Permits for Wisconsin Permitting Operations. I am your presenter, our moderator, Joe Lyman. I'm president of the Great Lakes Graphics Association. We represent printers, binders, converters, packagers, tag and label manufacturers throughout this three-state region, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and we represent about 240 of those active members in the three-state region. If you have any questions or comments, please, again, use the chat feature. We'll be happy to unmute myself and then ask the question. And again, the webinar is being recorded. I'd like to welcome Gary Jones, Alex Torres, and Renee Lesjak-Basso as our presenters today. Gary Jones is the Director of Environmental Health and Safety Affairs for Printing United Alliance. Printing United Alliance is the largest member-based printing and graphic arts association in the United States that provides resources, programs, education, and research to help printing companies grow their businesses. Gary has over 30 years of experience in helping members understand their compliance requirements and works with regulatory agencies on behalf of the printing industry. As an aside, Great Lakes Graphics is an affiliate of the Printing United Alliance. Alex Torres has a bachelor's and master's degree in civil and environmental engineering from University of Puerto Rico. He pursued a PhD degree at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He has conducted research in the areas of fate and transport of pollutants in soils and the transport of deposition of atmospheric pollutants. In 2014, Alex joined the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources as a permit writer. In 2015, Alex was appointed as the statewide registration permit coordinator responsible for granting coverage under the registration permits program, developing compliance assistant materials and coordinating compliance activities. Finally, we welcome Renee Lesjak-Basso. She is the coordinator for DNR's Small Business Environmental Assistant Program. Renee has been providing compliance assistance on environmental rules for Wisconsin small businesses for nearly 20 years. For 8 years prior to that, she wrote permits and did compliance inspections for the air program at DNR. Also, she has for a few years, Renee was a project manager, environmental sciences area for SCS engineers in Madison. Welcome, Gary, Alex, and Renee.
Oh, thank you, Joe.
Gary?
Oh, yes, thanks, Joe. I wasn't sure if you're going to handle the agenda, but I can certainly do that. First of all, let me say thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We're very excited to have you participate and learn about the new registration operating permit, streamlined permit for printing operations. And I must say, too, I've worked with Renee and Alex very closely on the development of this permit. And I think collectively, we are happy and excited to be able to present the revised permit to you. So the focus of today, what we wanted to do is break this into three distinct areas. We wanted to focus first on air permitting in general, and I'll be covering what general requirements of air permits and talk about the structure of air permitting in the state of Wisconsin. Alex is then going to take us through the Type C permit, the ROP C permit, the requirements and the changes, highlighting where there was work done and how the permit was revised. And then Renee will follow up as our third speaker today, talking about the compliance assistance resources. As Joe had said in the introduction for Renee, she's been at this for quite some time. I've worked with Renee for many years, helping our members. Renee is an excellent resource, helping our members understand compliance requirements, especially when it comes to air pollution, but she's also a great resource on other environmental compliance requirements as well. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, as I said, I'm going to walk us through air permit options and eligibility for registration permits. Next slide, Joe. All right. Well, what I think I would start with is the basic question, because I do get this question from time to time from our members, is what is an air permit? I mean, and that's the basic starting point for really for compliance with air pollution regulations. And essentially, I think the way to look at an air permit is really, in essence, a legally binding document that's issued to industrial sources that allow them to emit air pollutants. Think of it as a contract, so to speak. And that contract's going to have terms and conditions in it. And those terms and conditions need to be met that allow your facility to legally operate in the state. So those terms and conditions are going to be the regulatory limits. And those regulatory limits could be on materials. It could be requiring, depending upon the type of printing press or printing operation you're using, it could require you to use perhaps add-on controls or pollution control devices. There's going to be requirements in there that you're going to have to follow to show compliance, because usually every time that you have a regulatory limit, there's also going to be a compliance demonstration requirement that goes along with it, because of course the agency was going to want to know, are you meeting the limits that are in those permits? So that collectively gets put into that document called an air permit. Permits are required when air pollution emissions exceed a specified amount or a specific threshold. And there are thresholds in the state of Wisconsin that we need to be aware of. And the way that the DNR has, their permit program has evolved over the years is that they have separate permits for new equipment installation called construction permits. They have separate permits for operation. And then the type of permit that you have to obtain for your operation really depends for the most part on emissions. And emissions, when we say emissions, those are basically the releases of air pollutants into the atmosphere. Next slide, please, Joe. In terms of the structure of the permits the DNR has, there's really 3 permits. The first, as I mentioned, is a construction permit. And basically, a construction permit is a permit that you have to have in hand prior to either installing a new piece of equipment or, say, modifying a piece of equipment. A construction permit gives you that authorization to conduct that activity, to put the press in or make a modification, say, if you're going to add a coating unit. Or there was a time it was pretty common where folks were taking non-heat set web presses and converting them to heat set web presses. In that case, that's considered a modification. So under those types of scenarios, you'd have to apply for and get permission prior to undertaking that activity. Once that activity is up and done and you're up and running, basically you then have to obtain an operating permit. And an operating permit is going to be very similar to a construction permit, although the operating permit won't expire as quickly as a construction permit. That will have to be renewed about every 5 years. You have to go in and apply for a renewal for an operating permit. And the operating permit, as the name applies, gives you the authority to operate your source. So you think it is a 2-step process. Step 1 is construction permit, and then step 2 is then you move into an operation permit. And then over the years, the DNR actually undertook some streamlining efforts and came up with what's called a registration permit. And really, to me, the beauty of the registration permit is twofold. One is it combines construction and operating permit into one. So under the scenario where you have to have a construction permit and you have to have an operating permit, it usually requires you to develop and submit 2 separate applications. You go through 2 separate permitting processes, and you have back and forth, and you have an interaction with the DNR permit engineer until the permit's finally issued. Under the registration permit, to me, I think really what makes the most sense if you qualify for the registration permit is it's actually a combined construction operating permit. You're allowed to construct without additional permit fees, and usually it's turned around rapidly. It's usually within 15 days from the time that your application is deemed complete, whereas construction permits and operating permits can stretch out and can take quite some time to get those issued. So in an effort to streamline the regulatory process, the DNR came up with the registration permit. And then there's different forms of registration permits, which we'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, the exemption. So before we get into the specific registration operating permits, we really need to know, do I need a permit? Obviously, that's the question. Have I exceeded some type of emission threshold in which a permit's required? One thing that's interesting to know is that if you do not exceed that threshold, obviously a permit's not required, but you do need to keep records to show that you're under that threshold for permitting. And in addition, even though you may be exempt from a permit, there may be other control requirements that you may need to meet because those requirements could apply to your operation even though you don't have a permit. Obviously, if you do have a permit, all those control requirements get rolled up into the permit. But if you are not required to have a permit, you still may have to meet some requirements. And the thresholds for those requirements do differ. And specifically, they do differ, for example, for the what's called reasonably available control technology, or RACT rule, for litho operations. But for printing, in terms of exemptions, there's several exemptions that you can take advantage of. In other words, if my thresholds of emissions are below these numbers that are identified here in the second bullet, I don't need to get a permit. And so let's take a look at them. There's one threshold that's based on actual emissions. So if my actual emissions of my criteria pollutants, and typically for printing a criteria pollutant, the most common one is going to be volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. If it's less than 10 tons per year, and my air toxics, are called hazardous air pollutants, are below a threshold of 10 tons for a single hazardous air pollutant, or 25 tons combined, I don't need a permit. So, you know, the question you say to yourself, well, how do I know if I need a permit or not? Well, what you actually need to do is what's called, I call an air emissions inventory. You actually need to go through and do calculations, determine what those emissions are of the volatile organic compounds primarily. Well, there's other criteria pollutants, nitrogen oxides, if you're doing some type of large fuel combustion source, but primarily for printing, it's volatile organic compounds. And I have to look at my hazardous air pollutants, or my air toxics, and determine whether or not I'm exceeding a threshold for those. And that requires you to do some calculations. Now, there is a specific source category exemption in the state of Wisconsin, and that means if all my printing, if all the emissions coming from my printing operations are less than 1,666 pounds per month of VOC, I also am considered exempt. And again, that requires you to do a calculation on a monthly basis, as well as doing the calculations on an annual basis. And then there's the third one, the general, and that's based on hourly emissions. Now, there's a term that gets used in the air permitting category called maximum theoretical emissions, or MTE for short. And basically, you think of that as your potential. In other words, if I was to operate my equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week under my worst case scenario, what would my emissions look like? And if my thresholds are below 5.7 pounds per hour for VOC, and if my hazardous air pollutants or my air toxics are below the individual thresholds identified in the regulation, I don't have to have a permit. So your pathway to getting an exemption from permitting will depend upon really what the emissions are, as I said in my first slide, and then you have to actually calculate and determine those emissions. And if you're not quite sure how to do that, there's resources available, and we actually have some emission guides, and Renee will be talking about some of the resources that we have developed over the years and make them available. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay. Oh. Now, the types of registration permits, as we had mentioned. Really the focus of today's discussion is the registration permit C, option C for printers. And basically, it's a cap on your criteria emission pollutants of less than 25% of the major source threshold, and Alex is going to walk through those a little bit. There's a limit as to 50% of the major source threshold on your operations, and it includes specific requirements for print operations. If your emissions are of the threshold, but the emissions are less than the numbers that we've talked about here, then you can qualify for the easy streamlined registration permit C. If your emissions are a little bit higher from your criteria pollutant, then you may qualify for the registration operating permit B. And for the printing industry, for the most part, the printing industry can qualify for usually the ROP C or the ROP B, with the ROP C being by far the most common registration permit that the printers obtain. Okay, Joe, next slide. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and he's going to walk us through the requirements of the ROP C, the changes, and the requirements. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Gary. So I'm going to start first talking briefly here about the history of the ROP C. While developing the DNR's environmental resource program for printers, it was recognized that a subgroup of printers will need to be covered by an air permit. On July 11, 2006, the DNR received a petition from the Department of Commerce to create a registration operation permit for printers to fit that need. On April 20, 2007, the Type C registration operation permit for printers, also known as a ROPC, was issued to provide that coverage. Only printing facility with a primary standard industrial classification code of 23, 26, or 27, a primary North American industrial classification system code starting with 3231 or 5111 for the operation of their business are eligible for the ROPC. In 2019, the Wisconsin Printers Council, formed under the Wisconsin Printers Green Tier Charter, expressed the need to update the ROPC because several rules in the Wisconsin Administrative Code have been revised since 2006, including the new lithographic printing rules. As a result of this request, the department revised the ROPC on September 21st of this year. Currently, there are 67 printing facilities in Wisconsin operating under the ROPC coverage. The main benefits of the ROPC are: number one, flexibility to construct and operate the source; number two, streamlining application and review process; number three, wide range of compliance assistance materials are available; number four, low annual emission fees; and number five, no expiration date. On this presentation, I'm going to start discussing the ROPC requirements. Then I will describe the new changes to the ROPC. Next slide, please. So let's start with the ROPC requirements. There are four major requirements under the ROPC. Those are emission caps, additional VOC emission limits, air quality analysis, and compliance demonstration requirements. Next slide. So all registration permits limit emission as a percentage of major source threshold. In the case of the ROPC, it limits the emission of criteria pollutants to 25% of the major source threshold, and also to 50% of the major source threshold of federal HABs. As you can see in the table, the cap, in the case that we have a facility located in an attainment area, the major source threshold is going to be 100 tons per year for PM10, SO2, CO, VOC, NOx, and it's going to be 10 tons per year for a single federal HABs, or 25 tons per year for the combination of all federal HABs. So that means that the permit is limiting. In the case of facilities located in attainment area, it's going to be 25 tons per year of any criteria pollutant, 5 tons per year for any single HAB, or 12.5 for the combination of all HABs. However, we have certain areas in the state that are classified as a non-attainment. For example, you can see on the map at the right side of the screen, the east side of the Kenosha County is classified as a serious non-attainment area for ozone. So in that case, any printing facility at that location is subject to the 12.5 emission limits of VOC and NOx. In the case that this area is bumped up again, so the VOC limit will go down to 6.25 in the case that the area is a severe non-attainment area. If you have any question about the classification of any area in the state, you can access that link showing on the screen, and you can try to find the area and the county, and you will find what are those major source thresholds. Next slide. One of the most limiting factors for facilities operating under the ROPC is the requirement in NR 424.03 for process line emitting organic compounds. This rule requires that all process lines that emit 15 or more pounds of VOC in any day should meet one of the following. Number one, they should meet a reasonable available control technology, or RAC, in section NR 422.14 to NR 422.145. Number two, they can apply latest available control techniques, or LAC, which requires to limit VOC emission to less than 10 tons per year per process line. Or number three, they can apply 85% control of VOC. Most printing facilities located in counties that are not affected by a RAC elect to adopt the LAC limit of 10 tons per year per process line. However, assuming the facility is located, only operating one process line, then the facility-wide emission limit is going to be 10 tons per year instead of the 25 tons per year for VOC. Next slide. Air quality analysis under the ROPC are less rigorous compared with other types of registration permits. The main reason for this is that VOC is the primary pollutant emitting from printing facility, which is now required to be modeled. ROPC only requires modeling for PM10 and lead if the emission exceeds any of the following thresholds. Number one, facility operates a heat set offset printing press that emits more than 0.5 pounds per hour of PM10. Number two, the maximum control emissions of PM10 from heat set offset and diesel fire combustion units combined are more than 5 tons per year. Or number three, the maximum control emission of lead from all letter presses at the facility exceed 0.2 tons per year. Air quality analysis is part of the initial review conducted by the department. However, any facility planning to install a new heat set offset press, a diesel fire combustion unit, or a letter press may have to repeat or conduct a new modeling analysis. If the future emission, if the maximum control emission in the future will be exceeding the threshold mentioned before. Next slide. Now I'm going to talk about some of the compliance requirements under the ROPC. I think the most important one is the all facility operating under the ROPC coverage should assure that appropriate methods for demonstrating compliance are in place and follow for all requirements applicable to the facility in Chapter 285 of the Wisconsin Statutes, Chapters NR 400 to NR 499 of the Wisconsin Administrative Code, and in the Clean Air Act. Facilities are required to calculate annual action emissions by March 1st of each year to demonstrate compliance with the permit caps. They can use the typical method where the emission factors are used or material balance. The second option is to demonstrate compliance with the permit caps by meeting the material and fuel usage threshold listed in attachment 1 of the ROPC. Facilities are also required to prepare a malfunction prevention and abatement plan for each emission unit that emits hazardous substances or emits more than 50 pounds in any day or 3 pounds in any hour of any air contaminant. The plan should be in writing and updated at least every 5 years. Facilities are also required to prevent malodorous emission and prepare another control plan if necessary. Facilities are also need to calibrate all the instrumentation using to monitor the air pollution control devices at least every year. Next slide. Any facility that detects a deviation is required to notify the department by the next business day. Form 453182 can be completed and uploaded into the DNR switchboard. By March 1st of each year, facilities covered by ROPC are required to submit an annual compliance certification and summary of monitoring. Note that these are two separate requirements. However, the department has developed Form 453178, which covers both requirements. This form can be completed and uploaded into the DNR switchboard, and Renee is going to be discussing that form later. By March 1st of each year, facilities are also required to submit an air emission inventory report, or if the annual emissions are below the reporting levels in NR 438, then they can submit an under threshold notification, also known as UTN. which can be generated and uploaded through the DNR switchboard. Then by June 30th of each year, facilities shall pay the annual emission fees. Facilities are also required to report to the department any changes of ownership or control within 30 days after the change. All right, next slide. In the second part of this presentation, I will briefly discuss the new changes in the RUPC. Next. So the new permit or the revised permit include new definition. For example, we added the definition to capture efficiency, control efficiency, overall control efficiency, and so on. The phrase insignificant emission units was replaced with emission units not subject to certain requirements through the permit. Reference to total PM was replaced with PM10 and PM2.5, which are the criteria pollutants. A new permit condition was added to remind facilities that if they are subject to a RAC standard in section NR 422.14 to NR 22.145, they shall meet this requirement. They don't have the option to meet the lag. Next slide. Table 2 of the RUPC was also updated to match the current RAC requirements in the Wisconsin Administrative Code that include the new lithographic rules in NR 422.142 and 143. The modeling section was updated to clarify the modeling requirements and to include the new requirements for modeling lead. The prohibition that facilities covered under the RUPC facility covered under the RUPC provision that facility covered under the RUPC cannot be classified as a major source. That condition was also added to the permit. The option of using control efficiency higher than those listed in the permit for the calculation of emission is now limited to oxidizers. Next. The minimum control efficiency listed in Section G of the RUPC now refer to the overall control efficiency, which is the combination of the capture and control efficiency. The requirement for preparing a malfunction prevention and abatement plan was included in the permit. Also, the requirement to calibrate air pollution control monitoring devices was added. Output of back leak detection is now allowed as a monitoring parameter for backhouse. Next. The due date of the annual compliance certification was moved from June 30th to March 1st of each year. This is similar to all other registration permits. Additional reporting requirements, such as the next day deviation report and the submittal of air quality analysis, was included in the permit. Last, the annual material and fuel usage threshold was updated in the permit. So with that, I conclude my section. Now, Renee will continue.
All right, thanks, Alex.
Actually, I have a few questions, if it's okay. Renee, this is a good break.
Yep.
I have a question regarding the printing exemption option. Does each option have to be met or just one of the three?
You only have to meet one of the three. So if you qualify for an exemption under any of those three options, you're considered exempt.
Excellent. And I have a follow-up question. Is a malfunction prevention and abatement plan required if the facility does not have any air pollution control devices?
I think my understanding is yes. You can have heaters, which emits also hazardous air pollutants, and you still need to have the malfunction prevention plan even for heaters.
Excellent. All right, sorry to interrupt, Renee.
No, perfect. That's good to get those out of the way here. All right. So I think we've mentioned it a couple times that there's a number of things in the registration permit that really aren't spelled out. So the Small Business Assistance Program has worked closely with AIR Program and the association folks, Gary and some of his colleagues, and to develop some resources that would help facilities meet these permit requirements. So I'm going to walk through some of those, show you where to find them and how they might help you. Next slide. So first thing I want you to be aware of is how to find all the registration permit information. It wasn't that long ago that we created a page to hold all of the registration permit information in one spot. So now you might want to, if you're in the registration permit arena, bookmark that page. Some of the DNR web page formatting has changed things and it can be difficult to find things. Within that registration permit page, you can see kind of a snippet of the tabs that we have on that page. Each permit has its own tab. The new ROP-C, I've also wanted to include a link to the final permit here for you. You might also want to bookmark that and hang on to that in case you lose the paper copy that got mailed out to all the current facilities that were covered by it originally. Or if you want to look at switching to the type C, take a look at that final permit before you make that change. Next slide. Just wanted to show a couple snips from the final permit. Alex already talked about the emissions thresholds, but I wanted to highlight, that you've got both the written limit of 25% of the major source thresholds for criteria, pollutants, and so on. But the permit also includes that table of what the different thresholds are depending on the non-attainment area. So as you transition, if you're in a particular area that is changing, you wouldn't necessarily have to get a different permit if you can meet the lower threshold based on that non-attainment category for your county. I also wanted to highlight here this A2 condition on the bottom left here, that other applicable requirements. That's kind of that all-encompassing requirement that Alex mentioned, that you need to comply with everything in the AIR statutes, the AIR Administrative Code, and the Clean Air Act. Because that's kind of all-encompassing and it's not written out exactly what parts of those you might have to comply with, a number of our resources have been created to help you with that part. Next slide, please. Another snip from the permit I wanted to highlight. You can see the racked and lacked conditions on the left side that Alex mentioned. Number 6 being that if the racked rules do apply to you, you have to meet those. There's no option to opt out of those. But under the lacked requirements in 7, if say it's not technically applicable to you, you can still opt into meeting the racked rules. Say if you're in a different county that's not written in the rule, or you're below those thresholds, something like that, you can still meet those emissions limits instead of the lacked limitation if you choose. Of course, you have to be the right kind of press that the racked rule is about to use that. The table 2 that we mentioned in the permit that has the racked limits, it only highlights the emissions limits that apply to each of those sections. There's still record keeping and control device monitoring that would be written out in the code that you have to go back and review outside of the permit. Next slide. This one is just a quick snip of the screen printing rule. Just wanted to highlight that while the previous Type C had an old version of the screen printing rule for quite some time, it has been updated, and those old screen printing, the screen cleaning limits that had been in a previous racked rule are no longer in the permit. Next slide. One of the resources that we created with this new registration permit revision was a VOC rule applicability flowchart, just to help folks kind of walk through and figure out if those RACT rules do apply to them or not. Number of the changes, the rule changes, have added additional applicability paragraphs, and so it's important to make sure you've walked through and checked on those. We've got the link right here. You can always search by the publication number, the AM588, and find it that way. But really what it does is it's got a page for each of the press types that have a RACT rule. It walks through the different applicability sections and then highlights which of the emission limits would apply if you meet one of those applicability statements. And if it'll walk you through the process that if none of them are applicable to you, you can go back to start over and look at a different press type that you might have. Or if none of them are actually applicable, then it takes you to the LACT requirements on the last page. Again, this is only including the emission limits to kind of point you in the right direction. It doesn't have all the other requirements like monitoring or records. So you still have to go back to the rule to check on some of those. And this one is specifically on the ROPC tab with the other permitting, the ROPC permit documents. Next slide. And with this one, with the revision to the ROPC, the application form and an application guide have all been updated to go along with that. This would be handy. You don't need this if you've already got the ROPC and you're going to stick with it. But if you're in a different category and you want to switch over to the ROPC, or you have a source specific permit and you want to change into the ROPC, take a look at the guide, make sure you can walk through and answer all of the applicability questions successfully to get through and then fill out the application form. And then as was mentioned earlier, it's a pretty quick turnaround once you've got a complete application in. Next slide. For a long time, we had a lot of different pages with printer resources on them, different air permit pages and the green tier pages and so on. And it was hard to find some of the resources that were out there. And what we did last year was pull them all together into a printer portal as your first stop to get to all the different resources that DNR might have for your environmental requirements. So we've got tabs on that page for general environmental requirements. We've got a page for your green tier with information about the charter. We've got waste, air pollution, water, and online resources then as well. The environment tab has a connection to that environmental results program, environmental compliance workbook. So each of the chapters are linked there and they're all being updated. The content is updated there. There's also a self-evaluation checklist to go through all of your environmental requirements if you feel the need for that. The air pollution tab has links to all of the ROPC information, the RACT rules. We've got different fact sheets there, and the emissions guide. That was updated a couple years ago now, I think. Next slide here. All right, that emissions calculations guide, that would be the pub AM525 if you want to search for that. But it walks through each of the press types and explains your VOC calculations, and it splits them up into different categories that US EPA created that they call source classification codes. And so they split it up into drier and non-drier emissions, or fugitive and captured emissions. And it lays out how to calculate each one of those, shows you the equations, and gives you some examples. So that's a helpful piece if you're going to go through and calculate your emissions and you're not sure how to do that. Next slide. One of the reasons you might need to calculate your emissions is for that annual emissions report. As Alex mentioned, this one's required by March 1st. The threshold for reporting for VOCs is 3 tons per year. And then any of the HAPs have their individual thresholds in there. Alex mentioned a couple times that you need to file different reports to DNR through the switchboard. If you've never done that before, you need to go get your WAMS ID, and you do that through the switchboard. And every reporting program for air initiates through the switchboard. You log in and select the different options under that. I've also got a link here. It can be helpful to know the pollutant reporting thresholds, and we've got a searchable database at that link. And then there's a number of tutorials to help you out with the emissions reporting system. And you can get to that from our printer portal page on the online resources tab. Under the air bullet there, we have a link to the emissions reporting page. And all of those other pieces are there, but sometimes these links are helpful to have in another resource. Next slide. The other piece that's due on March 1st that Alex mentioned was changed in the new ROPC from June 30th now to March 1st is the permit compliance certification form. And we've just got a quick snip of it here along with the link. And this is being updated slightly. So it'll look a little bit different from this snip when it's final in a couple weeks. But you can get to that if we go back to that registration permit page on the compliance resources tab. We've got links to the forms there. Next slide, please. And then another piece that we created that I wanted to share is related to that compliance certification form. And this is kind of a compliance status review tool, if you will. Particularly helpful for that more generic, all applicable requirements must be met condition that's in the permit. To help you, we've gotten this question in the past, I'm not sure how I can be comfortable certifying to compliance, and I'm not sure how to walk through all those conditions and make sure that I've evaluated them properly. So what we've got here in this tool is the first column will have each of the conditions that are in the ROPC kind of listed out there. The second column would be a place for you to mark off if you're in compliance or not. And then the last column has links to a range of resources that can help you sort out how you might demonstrate compliance with that particular permit condition, whether it's spreadsheets for calculating emissions or links to fact sheets that give you a plain English summary of the requirement, something along those lines. When it comes to that more generic condition of comply with everything that applies, we did add rows, and you'll see them in the document in more of a peach color highlighting, that any of the conditions within 400 to 499 that could likely apply to printers. They may not apply to your particular facility, but you've got some information there on what you might need to do, some resources to figure out if you're in compliance with it. And that would be a place to document that, okay, we looked at this requirement, we figured out this doesn't apply to our facility for X, Y, and Z reasons, and document that there and keep that on record that you've made that determination. And that can be really important for your compliance status down the road. And a link to this is available on that registration permit page on the compliance resources tab. And it would also be on the printer portal under the air pollution tab. So a couple places. And then you can also search on SB 010 for the publication number. Next slide. And with that, so maybe you're new to registration permits and you want to apply, or maybe you want to switch over to the ROPC. Again, here's the registration page link. And a reminder that all of the DNR application forms and certification forms, those are best opened when you're in Internet Explorer, because of the active fill-in option that PDF, the PDF version offers there. Whether you're new to the registration permit or you're going to switch, you're going to use that same application form for the type that you want to move to. And then some other benefits for registration permit facilities for all of them. No matter which one you've got, the small business program has been working with Alex and some of the other inspectors to send out quarterly compliance reminder emails, just to give you some quick snippets of information to help you comply with different parts of your permit. And if you're curious about what some of those emails contain, we are also posting old ones on that compliance resources tab on the registration permit page. With that, that's all I have. So we can get to any other questions folks have.
I will be unmuting everyone. So if you have a question, we do have, Alex, we do have a follow-up to the question that we asked before. So the gentleman said, what if we have no heaters? And he described what building heaters apply. I'm asking for a facility that prints water-based only flexographic inks and adhesives. It does not use any air permit controls.
Well, if they don't emit any hazardous air pollutants, or if they are emitting other pollutant less than the threshold that we have, then they will need the malfunction prevention plan.
Yeah, I would say with water-based inks for flexographic printing, I doubt they meet the threshold. Although, don't take that for expert.
Yeah, I would say my strong recommendation is to take advantage of the tool that Renee had talked about in terms of emission calculations. And if you need some help, you can certainly reach out to me or Renee in terms of the calculations. But I think it would be appropriate to at least do that, at least annually do a calculation to make sure that you're under the threshold, and
right.
and you would keep records for that, just to show that you went through that. Went through the process of determining that you were exempt from a permit.
Yeah, typically we don't have air issues, but water certainly for flexographic water-based inks, correct? I mean, that's kind of the rule of thumb that we usually follow.
Yeah, I mean, I mean the nature of the inks are such that the VOC contents are fairly low in those ink systems, but it's also an issue of throughput. So in other words, even though I might have, some low VOC containing materials, if I use enough of them, there are going to be some emissions associated with them.
Right.
So, so it's an issue of really at that type of situation, it's a throughput question. If it's narrow web label, flexo label, I would say probably, unless you, again, the other thing is the number of presses that you have. If you have 1 or 2 presses, you're probably fine. If you had, right. I know this is an exaggeration, if everybody had 100 presses, it'd be a different ball game, right? So it's still worth doing that calculation.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question, can you use the control efficiency determined in a stack test to show compliance with emission caps in ROPC?
Yeah, I would say yes. So testing will be required by RAC, or if you are electing to meet the RAC, you might need also to do testing. The thing is that if you want to use more than what is in the RAC, let's say for the new lithographic rule part 2, it is required to control by 95% VOC. So let's assume you did testing and then you found that you are controlling 98% of those VOC. So for the first 5 years, you can use 98. And then if you want to continue using 98 in the future, you gotta repeat your test. So you have to keep doing that every 5 years. If you don't want to repeat, then you gotta use, depending if you are subject to the RAC, so you might need to use 95, which is in the RAC, or if you are not subject to the RAC, so you gotta keep meeting the control efficiency that is in the ROPC, which is 90%.
Excellent. I have a question for Gary. If I determine that I don't need a permit, do I need to apply? Do I need to notify DNR?
No, there's no notification requirement. You would just need to be able to keep the records and be able to produce the records if you were ever asked to do so by the DNR.
Excellent. Alex, why should I apply for a ROPC instead of another type of registration permit?
Well, I think we always encourage any printing facility to apply for the ROPC first, because the permit was tailored for you. Actually, you will find very familiar language that you can understand. Also, you will only find conditions that might apply to the printing facility. You won't find, like, for example, in the ROP B or ROP A, you will find some a condition that apply to asphalt plant. And then that will facilitate all the compliance demonstration, because everything that is there applied to you. Another thing is that you have as Renee showed, you have all the list of racks that might apply to you, so you can refer to those quickly. You don't have to search in the code. What other things? You have also you can use the material usage and fuel usage method to demonstrate compliance with emission limits. Modeling, you only need to model for PM10 and lead versus the ROP A and ROP B, where you got to also model for SO2 and NOx. And also you have the list of units that are not subject to certain permit requirements. It actually includes units that are part of the printing facilities versus other permit, you won't find those units there.
Excellent. I have a question.
And Joe, let me add one point to Alex's list. You'll notice that the ROP B and the ROP C permits are the two most common ones that printing facilities take advantage of. And there's a difference in the allowable emissions. So the ROP C has a little bit lower, has a lot lower threshold compared to the ROP B. So in terms of the choice of which permit to use, it may be driven by the emissions from your operation.
Excellent. Renee, I have a question for you. Besides the air permit information you mentioned on the website, what other type of information can you find on the portal? And do you provide one-on-one assistance to companies that have questions about the ROPC program permit?
Yeah, well, first, yes, we absolutely could talk one-on-one with folks who have questions about the ROPC. But as to some of the other pieces of information that you'd find on the printer portal, we've got, as I mentioned, the environmental compliance assistance workbook. We've got materials. There's chapters on air, solid and hazardous waste, wastewater, stormwater, spills response, spills prevention, your EPCRA reporting, and a pollution prevention chapter. This was created a number of years back, and it's been updated recently, some chapters just this year, some previous years. The waste information, we've got links there to a number of the updated resources, including the rule on management of solvent contaminated wipes, those changes. We've got links to the Wisconsin Recycling Markets Directory. We've been working with the folks at UW Green Bay to update printer specific materials in their directory there. The water resources is a little less robust, but a lot of folks don't have a lot to worry about with wastewater, unless you are using a lot of water-based, but there are good links there to make sure you've got your no exposure certification for stormwater. And then with the online resources, as I mentioned, we've got links to each of the programs, air, waste, water, spills, to all of their different reporting systems, forms, permit applications where they're available on the website. Also on that is links to all of the sustainability webinars that we've done with under the Green Tier Charter for the printers. So that's all there in one spot.
Excellent. And I have a last question for Alex. What should I do if my facility is no longer eligible for ROPC?
Well, I think the first thing you gotta notify the department. You can talk with your inspector We can always find other permit options that you can apply. For example, you probably can apply for the RUB-B in the case that your emissions are more than 25 tons per year. Or in the case that you cannot meet any of those requirements in the RUB-B, so we might need to go through the application for a source-specific permit. And we can guide you through that. One thing that I forgot to mention is that all these thresholds, the 25% of the major source threshold, we are talking there about actual emission. We are not talking about PTE or maximum control emission or MTE. Everything is about actual emissions. So if your actual emissions are less than 25 tons per year for criteria pollutant or the other threshold for HAPs, then you will be eligible. So keep that in mind.
Excellent. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, so we try to keep this within an hour and respect everybody's time. But I do want to encourage everyone to reach out to our speakers today for any additional information. They are available. We are wanting to make sure that the print industry does have compliance in these particular instances with permitting and making sure that their facilities are running correctly in terms of compliance. So I'd encourage you to reach out to them. We'll also, as a follow-up to this, we'll send out the recording as well as include this information with it. But I encourage you to reach out. They're a wealth of information and really can make this much more simplified in terms of streamlining your permitting process. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time, and I especially appreciate the presenters today. Thank you and have a great day.